Hi everyone, in today's lesson I'm going to show you how to analyze a trig equation and gather information from it. So I'd like to start with a simple example. So example number 1, we'll say is y equals 3 sine 2x. So from this example, from this equation, we can find some information that will help us be able to graph these eventually. So for today, we're going to just analyze it, and then tomorrow you're going to learn how to graph with this information. So the first thing that we want to find is the A. A is the amplitude. And from the video yesterday, you should be able to remember that the amplitude is the number in front. So this number here, this 3, is my amplitude. So that goes 3. That's amplitude. Next, I want to find C, which means cycles. So again, from yesterday, you should remember that the cycles is the number that's next to the x. So the number of cycles we'll see here is 2. Next, I want to find the period, which I'll label as P. Now, there's a formula to find period if you don't have a graph. The formula is 2 pi over b, where b is the number of cycles. So 2 pi over the cycles, which is 2. These will cancel, and my period will be pi. And the last thing we need for graphing is I, and I stands for interval. So I'm going to write that down because this is new. Interval. And basically what interval means is basically this will give us our x-axis scale. This will tell us what we are counting by. When we make a scale. And we'll go over that in more detail later on in the next video, but for now I just want to be able to find the interval. And the definition or formula for interval is period over 4. So in this particular example, our period was pi, and all we're going to do to find the interval is do period divided by 4. So, period pi over 4. This is my interval, where pi is my period, 2 is my cycles, and 3 is my amplitude. And that's it. So for today's lesson, our main focus is going to be from this graph, can you tell me these 4 pieces? ACPI, amplitude, cycles, period, and then interval. So let's try a little bit more of a challenging example. All right, so example number 2, we'll say is y equals negative 2 cos 3x. So down the line here, we want A, C, P, I. So A is my amplitude. So from this equation, you should be knowing, okay, my amplitude is the number in front. So my amplitude you see here as a negative 2. I don't want you writing amplitude as negative 2. This negative just tells me that it's a negative cosine graph. So to avoid anybody doing that, I want you to get into the habit of saying the amplitude is the absolute value of the number in front. So the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So if you do that from now on, you'll never get amplitude wrong. So amplitude is always the absolute value, which represents positive distance. Okay, next is cycles. So cycles is the number in front of the x. So in this particular example, our cycles are 3. I will see 3 cycles between 0 and 2 pi. Period, remember, is the formula 2 pi over b, where b is the number of cycles. So in this case, it's 2 pi over 3. And then interval here is going to be a little bit challenging. Interval is period over 4. So my period is 2 pi over 3 all over 4. So this is kind of where you need to remember when we divide 2 sets of fractions. I know 4 is not a fraction, but you could make it one by putting 4 over 1. We keep the top fraction, so we change the division to a multiplication, and then we flip the 4 over 1 to 1/4. And then to simplify, we multiply straight across. So 2 pi times 1 is 2 pi, and we multiply the bottoms. 3 times 4 is 12. And then to simplify this, all we have to do is simplify 2 out of 12. I can divide the top by 2 and the bottom by 2. And by doing so, my final answer will be pi over 6. So for an example like such, we need to make sure that we remember the rule when dividing, we keep, change, flip. And that's it. That'll give us our information. All right, let's try one more example. All right, we'll call this last example, example number 3. So y equals 7 sine 1/2 x. So we've got our A, our C, our P, and our I. My suggestion for you would be to pause the video, try this on your own, and then hit resume for the explanation. Okay, so first things first, amplitude is the absolute value of the number in front, which is 7. Cycles is the number in front of the x, which here is 1/2. Period is 2 pi over b, where b is the number of cycles, so 2 pi divided by 1/2. And here we need to remember to keep, change, and flip. So we are keeping the 2 pi, changing the division to a multiplication, and flipping the bottom fraction of 1/2 to 2 over 1. And when you multiply straight across, you just get 4 pi. And then last but not least, for the interval is period over 4. So period is 4 pi divided by 4, which is pi. Okay? Okay, so that's really it for this lesson. I'd like to just give you a little preview into the graphing aspect. So remember I talked about interval. Interval was what we counted by. So I want you to think of counting by 2s, right? So if everybody would say counting by 2s, you would tell me 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, right? That's counting by 2s. What if I said counting by 5s? You would tell me 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, right? Now, what if I said count by pi's? You would tell me pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, right? That's counting by pi's. What if I told you to count by 2 pi's? You would say 2 pi, 4 pi, 6 pi, 8 pi, right? Now let's try one a little bit harder. What if I said count by pi over 2? Or in other words, 1/2 pi. So here how I'm counting. 1/2 pi, 2 halves pi, 3 halves pi, 4 halves pi, right? So I'm counting by pi's, which this one could actually be simplified a little bit more. This can stay pi over 2. These 2 can cancel. This would be pi. 3 pi over 2 can stay the same. And 4 halves reduces to 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2 pi. So if, say for example, I got an interval of pi over 2, this is how I would count, and this is what it would reduce to, right? So this is how you would set up your x-axis for your graph. You would have a pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So every problem you have will have a different interval, but just as kind of a preview, this is what I mean when I say count by pi over 2. Let's just do one more for fun. Let's just say I wanted to count by pi over 4. That's the same thing as saying 1/4 pi. So if I'm counting by fourths, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, right? That's what we count by. And if I wanted to simplify, this one can simplify and this one can simplify, right? 2 pi over 4 can actually simplify to 1/2. So that's pi over 2. And this one, the 4's will cancel, so it's just pi. So pi over 4, pi over 2, and 3 pi over 4 is what our simplified answer would be. So again, that's just a little preview as to where you're headed, but that'll help you graph, which will be tomorrow's lesson. Okay, have a great night, everybody.